Howdy, people. How goes it out there? Just getting some final things. Make sure I got this video pulled up for us. So, I saw the video Monday. I don't know when, obviously, it would have actually been recorded, but sometime very recently, William Lane Craig actually gave an in-person talk at a church of some sort, which is something that, to my knowledge, he has not done in at least in person in quite some time. Maybe I'm mistaken about that. I haven't seen him give any sort of talks like the one we're going to look at this evening in person in quite some time. Not that that's a bad thing. I mean, naturally, he's getting older, and also he's been busy with a lot of pretty sizable projects that he's been working on. But I sort of skimmed through the video, watched some parts of it, and I just thought it was worth talking about. I think there's some good things to cover with respect to the arguments that are presented in this video. So let me get this pulled up here and get ourselves set. Hopefully this is, yes, it looks good. So these are arguments for the existence of God. This was at Passion City Church. I don't know where that is. I don't know. 6 arguments. It says something about 5 in the video, so maybe there are 6. I don't know. Anyway, I thought that it would be worthwhile to go over these arguments. These are not new arguments. These are the same arguments that Craig has been running for quite some time, and I think it's time to take a look at them and see, do these arguments, are these good arguments for the existence of God? Are they enough to motivate belief in God reasonably? So let's just jump right in here.
Thank you so much. It is thrilling to me to know that you are here tonight because you believe in the importance of being trained in apologetics. And I've been asked to focus this evening particularly on that division of apologetics that deals with arguments for the existence of God. In our secular culture, I believe that it is vitally important that Christians be able to defend their belief in God. As a professional philosopher, I think that there are a number of good arguments for the existence of God, whereby a good argument, I mean an argument that makes its conclusion more probable than not. And tonight I want to share with you 5 such arguments. Now, in order to make these arguments easy to understand, I'm going to be showing some animated videos that we've developed at Reasonable Faith and which are available free of charge for downloading on your mobile device at our website, reasonablefaith.org. My goal is that when you walk out of here tonight, you will have in hand 5 arguments for God's existence that you can share with unbelievers.
So something that I just wanted to clarify, for each of these arguments, he does share the video that his team has developed. They developed these videos like 6 or 8 plus years ago, something along those lines. But after each video, Craig does go more in depth and kind of explain some of the concepts. So I might not do much responding to the material of the videos. I might just let the videos play, and then when Craig starts, diving into it and explaining things, that's where you're probably going to hear me start to provide some more criticisms.
So, are you ready? Let's go. Argument number one is the argument from contingency. This argument holds that God makes sense of why anything at all exists. This is the most fundamental question of philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing?
I think most philosophers today would disagree with that. I think that they would say that's not the most fundamental question of philosophy. I feel like a lot, maybe not most, but a lot of philosophers today would probably have an opinion something along the lines of that there isn't like a most fundamental question of philosophy, that there are maybe a series of questions that are fundamental to a variety of fields of philosophy. I also just personally don't think why is there something rather than nothing is even that interesting of a question. I'm not sure it's a meaningful question to ask myself.
Why does anything at all exist? The great German philosopher G.W. Leibniz came to the conclusion that the answer to that question is to be found not in the universe of contingent things, but in God. God exists necessarily and is the explanation why anything else exists. And the following video explains Leibniz's reasoning.
We live in an amazing universe. Have you ever wondered why it exists? Why does anything at all exist? Gottfried Leibniz wrote, the first question which should rightly be asked is, why is there something rather than nothing? He came to the conclusion that the explanation is found in God. But is this reasonable? Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists.
Just to reiterate, I'm going to let the videos play, kind of lay out what the argument is, what the defense of the argument is, and then when Craig starts going more in depth and starts explaining things out, that's where I'm going to start actually providing my objections to the arguments themselves.
From these, it follows logically that the explanation of the universe's existence is God. The logic of this argument is airtight. If the three premises are true, the conclusion is unavoidable. But are they more plausibly true than false? The third premise is undeniable for anyone seeking truth. But what about the first premise? Why not say, the universe is just there, and that's all? No explanation needed. End of discussion. Well, imagine you and a friend are hiking in the woods and come across a shiny sphere lying on the ground. You would, naturally, wonder how it came to be there. And you'd think it odd if your friend said, there's no reason or explanation for it. Stop wondering. It just is.
So I actually do want to respond to this, because when I was initially watching this, I don't think Craig really talked about this particular example when he started explaining things out. If you came across a ball, you would wonder where it came from, because we know balls come from someplace. We know balls, whether that's some sort of like, causal explanation, or you want to appeal to some other type of explanation. We know that balls have explanations because we know that balls are made by humans, that humans make balls. It's either going to be an inflatable ball, or it's going to be a rubber ball, or it's going to be something, and we're going to know, hey, a human made that. So right now, this analogy with the ball goes further, as we will see. But to ask where did this ball come from is reasonable because of our priors about where balls come from right off the bat. So
it is. And if the ball were larger, it would still require an explanation. In fact, if the ball were the size of the universe, the change in its size wouldn't remove the need for an explanation. Indeed, curiosity about the existence of the universe seems scientific and intuitive. Someone might say, if everything that exists needs
Also, if the ball became the size of the universe, it would cease to be a ball and would just become the universe. And we don't have any priors about universes coming from anywhere, so there isn't a reason to suppose that it did. Like, a ball and the universe are not, like, there isn't really a similarity between them that way, such that you could take a ball, make it the size of the universe, and claim, well, but it still needs an explanation. I don't think so.
needs an explanation. What about God? Doesn't he need an explanation? And if God doesn't need an explanation, then why does the universe need an explanation? To address this, Leibniz makes a key distinction between things that exist necessarily and things that exist contingently. Things that exist necessarily exist by necessity of their own nature. It's impossible for them not to exist. Many mathematicians think that abstract objects like numbers and sets exist like this. They're not caused to exist by something else, they just exist by necessity of their own nature. Things that exist contingently are caused to exist by something else. Most of the things we're familiar with exist contingently. They don't have to exist. They only exist because something else caused them to exist. If your parents had never met, you wouldn't exist. There's no reason to think the world around us had to exist. If the universe had developed differently, there might have been no stars or planets. It's logically possible that the whole universe might not have existed.
I think something that's worth clarifying here. Most metaphysicians are not going to take contingency to entail causality. Like, something's being contingent does not entail that it is caused. Something is contingent if it's not impossible, but not necessary. Another, I think, a little bit more, a simpler way of wording that is to say that something is contingent if it could have been otherwise. So I'm wearing a blue robe right now, but I could have been wearing a green robe. It's not impossible to wear a blue robe. Obviously, I'm wearing it, but it's not necessary that I wear a blue robe either. So me wearing a blue robe would be a contingent fact. It's not impossible, but it's not necessary. It could have been otherwise. This doesn't really say much about causality. You could have things that are contingent but uncaused.
It doesn't exist.
So I guess to say, I don't know, dishonest might be somewhat of a strong word here, but I think it's a little bit dishonest to define or at least associate contingency with causality.
Necessarily, it exists contingently. If the universe might not have existed, why does it exist? The only adequate explanation for the existence of a contingent universe is that its existence rests on a non-contingent being, something that cannot not exist because of the necessity of its own nature. It would exist no matter what. So, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. But what about our second premise? Is it reasonable to call the explanation of the universe God? Well, what is the universe? It's all of space-time reality, including all matter and energy. It follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause cannot be part of the universe. It must be non-physical and immaterial, beyond space and time. The list of entities that could possibly fit this description is fairly short, and abstract objects cannot cause anything. Leibniz's contingency argument shows that the explanation for the existence of the universe can be found only in the existence of God. Or, if you prefer not to use the term God, You may simply call him the extremely powerful, uncaused, necessarily existing, non-contingent, non-physical, immaterial, eternal being who created the entire universe and everything in it.
And just to clarify, you can grant all of that and still argue that it is that the entity is not an agent. Possessing all of the things that were just listed there does not entail that it must be an agent or that it must have a will or intention or something of that sort. So obviously I wouldn't, but I could grant the contingency argument and just argue that it's some sort of non-agential necessary being that is powerful enough to produce the universe, that is necessary, that exists by necessity of its own being, all of the things they just stated, and just be like, yeah, but it's not an agent.
Here once more are the premises of Leibniz's argument. Number one, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause.
So the first premise here is, in effect, just a restatement of what's known as the principle of sufficient reason. I would say a fairly strong version of the principle of sufficient reason, that any contingent fact requires necessitates some sort of explanation. Quite frankly, I'm going to reject a principle of sufficient reason on the basis that there's nothing that motivates me to accept it. I do think that there are some decent arguments against a principle of sufficient reason. Some people have cited like physical indeterminacy, usually at like the quantum scale or something. Quantum indeterminacy can be problematic for at least certain versions of the PSR. Is usually principle of sufficient reason. Is usually just abbreviated the PSR. So if you hear me just say PSR, that's what I'm referring to. Peter Van Inwagen, who's actually a Christian philosopher, has an argument against a reductio ad absurdum against the principle of sufficient reason, at least a stronger version of the principle of sufficient reason, like that's presented here, that all contingent facts necessitate some sort of explanation. And that's his argument is something, and I'm kind of being a little bit simple about it, but just to give the general argument is that if you have a set of contingent facts and the set itself is contingent, and there is some necessary explanation that is truly sufficient for explaining the set, then it would just follow that the set and all of its elements would also be necessary. If the explanation is both necessary and truly sufficient to explain the contingent set, then the contingent set itself would be necessary, and then you would just have modal collapse into necessitarianism. Or you might say that what would follow from that is that the set is just not contingent anymore, and so then the PSR would just be false. So you can see how that's sort of a reductio ad absurdum against the PSR, where we're taking the PSR and then showing how if we take the PSR to be true, that would just entail its own falsity from the modal collapse. So obviously, there have been a lot of people that have given responses to Van Inwagen's argument. I'm not entirely convinced of most of them. I think some of them are very interesting, but I don't know if I'm fully convinced that they overcome the argument. But regardless, that's just one argument that somebody could give, more of like a formal argument against the principle of sufficient reason, at least some sort of like strong PSR. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on that fact that within the realm of metaphysics, contingency arguments can actually get pretty deep. Almost all of them that I know depend, on some version of a principle of sufficient reason, whether some strong version or maybe a weak PSR where it's maybe not like it's something like all contingent facts possibly have some sort of explanation. Like there's a variety of ways it can be formulated. But me personally, I would just reject the PSR on the basis that I have no motivating reasons to accept it. I haven't been convinced that I need to accept either a strong or a weak PSR, and so I reject it for that reason. And since I reject the PSR, I'm just not going to take that contingent facts necessitate really of any sort, necessitates some sort of explanation.
2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. 3,
Obviously, I went over why that's not necessarily true. I can grant all of the listed properties that this excuse me, that this explanation of the universe is supposed to have: powerful enough to produce the universe, non-physical, non-spatial, non-temporal, necessary in its existence. I can grant all of those and just say, yeah, sure, maybe there's some sort of non-agential entity that possesses all of those properties and is sufficient for explaining the universe. And then it's just not God, because God is an agent. God is a person. God has a will. God has intention. So none of those properties entails that this has to be some sort of agent. So the second premise, I think, here is also problematic as well. I think one can easily object to not just the first premise by rejecting a PSR, but by the second premise, but can reject the second premise by granting all of the supposed properties the explanation of the universe has to have and just rejecting that it's an agent, which I think that you're entirely licensed to do.
The universe exists, from which it follows, 4, therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. Now, according to premise 1, there are 2 kinds of things: things that exist by a necessity of their own nature, and things that are produced by some external cause. Let me explain. Things that exist by a necessity of their own nature exist necessarily. It's impossible for them not to exist. Philosophers call such things metaphysically necessary beings.
So this notion of things existing, or I'll just use more general terms because this can be generalized beyond just existence, things obtaining in some metaphysically necessary sense is not agreed upon amongst all metaphysicians. This idea of specifically a metaphysical modality, that we can talk about things being possible or contingent or necessary. These would be known as modal terms in some strict metaphysical sense. That's the idea of a metaphysical modality, that those terms, necessity, possibility, contingency, have some application in a strict metaphysical sense. I reject that. I'm not sure what that means. I take, when I ask about something being, say, metaphysically necessary, usually what I get is one of 2 things. Either A, what they're really defining is just logical necessity, or existing in all possible worlds, all broadly logically possible worlds, which is just logical necessity. It can't fail to exist in any broadly logically possible world, then it's just logically necessary. But that would be the logical modality. That would be possibility, necessity, those kinds of terms in a logical sense, not in some strict metaphysical sense. Or I get some sort of physical necessity, that it exists because something about the laws of physics or the physical structure of reality necessitates it. But then again, that's the physical modality. You might often hear the gnomic or the nomological modality. That just means the physical modality, the way that the world works according to the laws of physics necessitates something or makes something impossible, like, say, going faster than the speed of light. That's physically impossible. It's not logically impossible. It's physically or nomologically impossible. So when I get asked for what it means for something to be metaphysically necessary, I either get a definition for logically necessary or gnomically necessary, again, physically necessary. But neither of those is some sort of strict metaphysical necessity. So I don't know what a metaphysical modality is. Some metaphysicians agree with that. Some try to give some sort of analysis of a metaphysical modality. So I think that that's something that needs to be remembered when we talk about this idea of metaphysical necessity. Also, I don't think that it's like gibberish to talk about something existing necessarily, but I'm not sure I understand precisely uh, what that would mean. I take necessity more to apply to like propositions or conclusions of arguments or stuff of that sort, rather than to the ontology of entities, rather than to the existence of entities. I'm willing to hear somebody out if they want to claim that something exists necessarily. It's just the burden is upon them to give an analysis of what it means to say that something exists necessarily, what it would be in virtue of that something's existence or something's ontology would be necessary, and under what sort of modality we would be defining that necessity. I've never heard anything excuse me, I've never heard anything that I find terribly convincing, but you never know what could come down the road. But I think that those are important points to bring up when people talk about things being metaphysically necessary or metaphysically impossible. Is stop for a second and just ask people what they mean by that, because a lot of times, and I don't want to sound like mean. Maybe I intend to sound somewhat critical, but I don't want to sound mean when I say this. There's a lot of people I think that use terminology that's not well defined, not necessarily because they're trying to be dishonest or obfuscate the discussion, but oftentimes because they've heard somebody like William Lane Craig, who's being a little imprecise with the language. They hear someone like him say something, and then they end up just kind of regurgitating it without ever doing any real analysis or real like conceptual analysis on what the terms mean, how they're defined, what they might apply to, what have you. And so I think it is important sometimes for us to stop, and rather than jumping on what somebody said, asking them maybe to explain their terms a little bit to see if what they're saying really has any sort of semantic import, whether there's any real meaning behind it with respect to the discussion that's being had.
Examples? Well, many mathematicians think that numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities exist in this way.
No, so I'm gonna mute myself here. So there are mathematicians who think that like numbers are like exist necessarily or something like that. I'm not convinced of that. I don't hold that mathematical. I think either with the contingency argument or it might be another argument. I think Dr. Craig sort of touches on abstract versus concrete, where numbers would be considered abstract. So the distinction between abstract and concrete, things that are abstract do not stand in causal relations. They don't cause stuff to happen. The number 3 doesn't cause anything. Whereas concrete things are things that do stand in causal relations. They do cause things to happen. You might say that an electron is a concrete entity because an electron can cause things to happen. That's sort of, the whole premise behind electricity and light bulbs and all that stuff. So that's the distinction between abstract things and concrete things. And in philosophy, there's a view known as nominalism about abstracta, which is the plural for abstractum or unabstract thing. And this is the idea that abstract things they don't exist. They're not real. They're more like these conceptual tools dreamt up by humans, contrived by humans that exist within the confines of our thought, but they're not things out in the world, so to speak, like an electron or a magnet or a star is. And that's the view I take. So I don't even take that numbers exist, really. I take them to be conceptual tools contrived by humans that are confined to our thought. Not things out in the world. And so for me, I'm not going to say that numbers exist necessarily. But again, I'm also not a mathematician and I'm not a philosopher of mathematics. So you can take what I say with a grain of salt.
By contrast, things that are caused to exist by something else don't exist by a necessity of their own nature. They exist because something else.
See, I think that something could be caused, but also be necessary. If X is necessary and X causes Y and X necessarily causes Y, then I would think that Y is also necessary. If X causes Y, X is necessary, X's causing of Y is necessary, and X is truly sufficient for causing Y, then I think it would follow that Y would be necessary. And so I don't think causality really plays much, maybe under certain analyses of causality. I just wouldn't be familiar with them. It might, but I don't think causality, generally speaking, really bears all that much on contingency versus necessity. I think there are ways that you could have something being caused but being necessary, like in the example I just gave. If X is necessary and necessarily causes Y, then it seems to follow, at least by my lights, that Y would also be necessary. So I don't like hashing out contingency versus necessity by using causal language.
Has produced them. If their causes were removed, then they would not exist. Examples? Familiar physical objects such as people, planets, and galaxies belong in this category. So when Leibniz says that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, that explanation may be found either in the necessity of its own nature or else in some external cause. So, what is the explanation of the existence of the universe? Where by the universe, I mean all of physical reality. It can only be found in an external cause which transcends the universe. Since it's not part of the universe of contingent things, this cause must exist by a necessity of its own nature. So if the universe has an explanation of its existence, there must be a metaphysically necessary, immaterial.
Okay, it took me a second to catch that, but I don't think that. So if you said that the set of all contingent facts, and this is where the nuance, when we talk about in metaphysics, particularly the field of modality, which is again dealing with the terms like concepts like possibility, necessity, contingency, and the various ways we can apply those terms and talk about them and talk about the kinds of things that are possible or necessary or contingent, and in virtue of what it's going to be that they're possible or contingent or necessary. That's modality. That's what modality talks about. So one could easily make a distinction between contingent and explained things and then brutally contingent things. Now, I would presume that Craig here, when he talks about the set of all contingent things, he means things that are both contingent and brutally contingent, which would be something that's contingent without explanation. Like, there is no explanation for its contingency. It most literally just is the way that it is, with no further explanation, reason, or context. But if one makes a distinction between those, you could have a set of all contingent things that is explained by something that is contingent, but brutally so, and it just happens to explain all otherwise contingent facts. I don't think that something being external to the set of contingent things must be necessary. But again, a lot of this comes down to the particular analysis that the person doing is going to take, that the person doing this analysis is going to take when they do it. So I think it's important to emphasize that there is a lot of nuance to how this works. You can't just say these things and then run this argument and be like, look, I've shown that God exists. Well, no, that's not how that works.
Material being beyond space and time. Now, there are only two candidates that could fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, can't cause any effects. So it follows logically that the cause of the universe must be a transcendent mind, which is what God is. So I hope you grasp the power of Leibniz's argument. If successful,
I'm going to say something that's might be controversial. Maybe it's not. I'm not really sure what transcendence is supposed to be as a concept. The closest that I can think of is something like supervenience, which, if I'm getting this right, is something like X supervenes on Y if some change in Y necessitates some change in X. I think I'm getting that right. I might have that backwards, but regardless of which way you put it, that's this notion of supervenience. Maybe something like that, but other than that, I genuinely am not sure what I'm supposed to understand transcendence to be. I think it's one of these words that, again, like, I don't think it's completely gibberish or completely meaningless, but I think that it's just, what's the word I'm looking for? I think it's conceptually vacuous. I'm not sure what concept I'm supposed to have in mind when I think of transcendence. Like I said, maybe something like supervenience relation, or maybe something like a causal relation. X transcends Y if X causes Y, if Y is causally dependent on X. Yeah, if that's what we mean by transcendence, sure, I can grant this. I can grant the concept, but I'm just not sure if that's what's meant.
It proves the existence of a
When I hear people use transcendence, it seems to be at least related to some notion of like a causal relation. Like, some people might say, oh, well, your parents transcend you, in the sense that, like, they caused you to exist, and your existence, at least to some extent, depends on them, but their existence doesn't depend on you. Maybe transcendence is some sort of dependence relation. Again, you can see how what these concepts mean, what these terms mean, really kind of depends on how we're analyzing the concepts. Is transcendence a causal relation, a supervenience relation, a dependence relation? If so, how is that being hashed out? And this is why I emphasize not just hitting the floor running or hitting the ground running when a theist gives you an argument, but asking them to explain their terms. Hey, you said God transcends the universe. Can I ask what sort of concept you have in mind, what you're thinking about when you say that God transcends reality? What sort of relation are we trying to figure out there? Because I think this really gets to whether or not people are saying things that have a meaningful analysis done on them, that are well-defined terms that help us understand things, or whether they're repeating something they heard somebody say at some point.
Metaphysically necessary, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal cause of the universe. This is truly mind-boggling.
Now, no, Dr. Craig has not given any argument for why we should think that. I can grant all the other properties he listed, but the one he did not, that he necessarily defended any of those, but I'll grant the inference he's making with respect to them. The one I won't grant here, though, is personhood. What's the argument that this, granting all of the other properties you just listed, what's the argument that it's personal? Why should I think that? And I'm not saying that Craig doesn't have an argument for that. As somebody who's read a lot of his work back when I was a theist, I could probably speculate as to his argument for the personhood of this transcendent, necessary cause of the universe, explanation of the universe. But again, trying to implant in people's minds this idea of asking questions, putting it back onto the other person to explain their terms and explain their arguments out a little bit more, rather than immediately going in on the attack. Let people do the work for you. Let them feed the rope for their own noose, so to speak, as many people use as an analogy.
Our next argument is the temporal version of the cosmological argument, which holds that God makes sense of the origin of the universe.
Yeah, James, immaterial, I think, in this context here, I would suppose that Craig just means some sort of, like, it's something that's non-physical. I think it's a little bit redundant to use the word immaterial if he's already using the terms spaceless and timeless. either that or it's the other way around. It's redundant to use the words spaceless and timeless if he's using the word immaterial. I think that generally speaking, when people think of the concept of immateriality, we're already supposing this notion of it not being extended through space-time, not being constructed or constituted of matter or energy. So I think to say an immaterial, spaceless, timeless, I think that's just a little bit redundant. So yeah, that's how I feel about his use of the word immaterial there. I think I know what he means by the word. I just think it's a little bit redundant to use it alongside the terms spaceless and timeless.
Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Well, typically atheists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But is that plausible? Our next video explains how
that the universe is eternal. Is that plausible? Yes, it's plausible. That doesn't mean that it's that it's likely, but it's plausible.
Scientific evidence for the origin of the universe points beyond the universe to its personal creator.
Once again, just letting people know, I'll be pausing minimally throughout the video. I'm going to focus on Craig's clarifications after the videos to give my responses.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is,
I'm going
or
to go
ever
fill my
was,
water cup.
or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1920...
Quick point of clarification. No, they didn't predict that the universe was expanding. The Friedmann solutions showed that that I think it's the scale factor, which is sort of a mathematical number that's used to sort of characterize the expansion of space or the non-static nature of space, that number could not be just like a static number, that it had to be a changing number. So the universe had to be either expanding or contracting according to the Friedmann solutions to Einstein's field equations. And then with Edwin Hubble's observations, we realized, redshift, so it's expanding. And this is what the cosmological constant was. It was supposed, actually, prior to Edwin Hubble's observations, that the universe was contracting as a result of the mutual gravitational attraction of everything in it and how that would act on space-time. And so Einstein introduced, because the cosmologists of that time thought the universe was static, that was the running position. So Einstein introduced the cosmological constant as this force that pushes back against the contraction of space-time equally to that contraction, such that space-time would remain static. So that's just some clarification on that point.
29, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past.
Well, no.
It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time.
Well,
More
not all of
recently,
them.
3 leading cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless.
Well, beyond space-time as we currently understand them. I mean, space-time might not even be fundamental. It could very well be an emergent structure. I think that's the direction a lot of physicists working in the area tend to lean.
Material, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful. Much like God.
What?
The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
So here again are the 3 simple premises of this argument. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2,
So, with respect to the first premise, so and I'm going to talk about, I mean, there's a lot of ways, actually, that the first premise of the Kalam can be objected to. Like, there really is a lot of ways. The first issue that I would have is with the notion of begins to exist. I think it's incoherent. I don't think the existence of things begins. I don't think things go from non-existence to existence, because if they're non-existent, there isn't anything to begin to exist to begin with. It just seems incoherent to me. I don't know what things don't sort of arrive into existence from not existing. Things can't be pulled into existence from non-existence. Non-existence isn't a state that you can reach into and pull things from into a state of, like, things don't begin to exist. Things might have beginnings, but they don't begin to exist. An analogy, and again, it's just an analogy, so it's not perfect, but I think it helps make the point. Imagine a house, you know. It's appropriate, I think, in most people's eyes, particularly if we're being charitable, to say that your house begins at the front door. But I don't think people would grant that it makes sense to say that your house begins to exist at the front door. The whole house already exists, and the front door is just a sort of front edge or boundary to that house. But it's not the moment where its existence begins. Hopefully that helps to understand at least how I draw a distinction between a beginning and begins to exist, where I take the latter to be well, quite frankly, just an unintelligible concept. So that's the first issue that I have. Now, suppose that we grant some sort of like, okay, material things are caused to exist by other material things or something like that. Well, I think that there's probably going to be some ways to object to that via quantum mechanics, at least in the sense that there are no sufficient conditions for the production of certain events. Maybe there's necessary conditions, but there aren't any sufficient conditions, with the difference there being that necessary conditions are the conditions under which an event might occur, but aren't sufficient for producing the event. And the sufficient conditions are the conditions that, in the presence of the necessary conditions, are sufficient for actually producing the event. And in the quantum realm, there are a variety of events that occur where there are necessary conditions for their occurrence, but there are no sufficient conditions for their occurrence. There are no conditions that determine precisely when and how these events are going to happen. There are merely conditions that dictate that they can. Radioactive decay is one. Quantum tunneling would be another. These vacuum field fluctuations, quantum fluctuations, as they're often referred to as, that would be another. There's necessary conditions for these events to happen, but there aren't any sufficient conditions for these events to happen. And causality, for the most part, is going to be constituted by sufficiency, where a causal condition is a condition sufficient for the production of the effect, which is just to say that if the sufficient condition is present, then its effect is present, then its effect it obtains. Whereas necessary conditions might be required for the event to occur, but again are not sufficient to actually produce the event. So I think that that's an important distinction to make. And again, I think causality is constituted by sufficiency rather than mere necessity in the context of sufficient conditions and necessary conditions. So that's at least one way that I would object to the first premise. There's other ways to object to the first premise. I don't want to sit here for 25 minutes and go through all of them, though, so I'm not going to do that.
2, the universe began.
But just broadly, you can attack the first premise on notions of causality. You can attack it on the unintelligibility of the notion of begins to exist. I'm not sure what concept's being captured there. I don't think there is an intelligible concept to be captured there. You could also attack the first premise on notions of time, where you could argue that the first premise depends on like an a-theoretic view of time, and then argue for a b-theoretic view. I'm not going to get into distinctions between a theory and b theory of time. There's plenty of videos on my channel where I talk about that. So,
and to exist, from which it follows 3, therefore the universe has a cause. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 14 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang.
So I don't think we have really any evidence that the universe is either eternal into the past or that it isn't. At least not evidence sufficient enough to motivate us in one direction or the other. And so I certainly don't think there's any evidence that there's an absolute beginning to reality, though I think I could grant that and that there would be no problems in doing so, if I'm being honest.
As explained in the video, in 2003, Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning.
So the BGV theorem is cited a lot by theists. It's also frequently misrepresented by them. Now, Craig will contend that he's not misrepresenting it, that Alexander Vilenkin has straightforwardly said that he's not misrepresenting it. And the way that he presented it when Alexander Vilenkin was responding to him was an accurate way of representing the theorem. This here is not. So if you have an inflationary spacetime with an averaged expansion rate, which I believe is h naught greater than 0, so the Hubble constant is greater than 0, i.e. the universe is expanding, that inflationary period cannot be extended indefinitely into the past. That's what it states. Inflation as a process cannot extend indefinitely into the past. The universe, as in the universe existing in some non-inflationary state from eternity past, absolutely you can have that. Inflation cannot be extended indefinitely into the past. But you could very, very well have some non-inflationary state of the universe, which does in fact extend indefinitely into the past. What the BGV theorem is not like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not profound. That's the word I'm looking for. The actual title of the paper is really the conclusion of the paper. Inflationary spacetimes are not past complete. Inflation cannot be extended indefinitely into the past. The universe in, say, some non-inflationary state, yeah, you could extend that indefinitely into the past. In fact, there's a variety of models that do exactly that. Now, sure, those models might not be very accurate. They might not map onto our reality, but that's not evidence that the universe doesn't extend indefinitely into the past. It's evidence that those, if it does, those models don't accurately capture the mathematics of that. I don't think we really have the physical techniques to answer these questions, at least as of yet. So I think there's just a lot more up in the air about whether the universe has an absolute beginning, whether inflation extends indefinitely into the past, though it probably doesn't, whether the universe extends indefinitely into the past through some non-inflationary means. We really can't answer a lot of those questions. The science is not even remotely as settled as people like Dr. Craig will make it out to be. Cosmologists have stated this on numerous occasions. Phil Hopper has at least 2 or 3 videos specifically on this question with both physicists and philosophers of physics. And they've all said, no, we don't know enough to answer these questions. And many of them have also said we could grant there being some sort of absolute beginning, but that in and of itself is not going to get you to a God. For a variety of reasons. So I think that it's important to that this is important to outline. And also I think it's important to outline that the Big Bang is not the earliest moment in the universe's history. Inflation is. The hot Big Bang phase is the reheating period that immediately precedes the inflationary epoch. It might not even be meaningful to ask if inflation has like some sort of start to it. That might just not even be the right kind of question to ask. We just don't have the physics capable of providing us with meaningful answers. We've got a variety of models. All of them fail for a variety of different reasons. Some seem more probable than others, but the science most certainly is not settled on this by any means.
And that goes for multiverse scenarios too. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that models which do not meet this one condition still fail for other reasons to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal. All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning." The Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical spacetime under a single very general condition cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now,
inflation, yes, inflation goes back to some boundary. And notice how we said classical space-time. That's correct. But we don't know how space-time behaves at the quantum scale. There might not be space-time at the quantum scale. Space-time might be an emergent thing. And if that's the case, then it's not, then there's no reason to suppose that the universe would have to have some sort of absolute beginning if space-time itself isn't even a fundamental structure. You could have some sort of quantum structure or quantum processes extending indefinitely into the past. This is there are plenty of models of that sort that cosmologists that work in this area are working with. Most of them, by my understanding, most of the experts working in that area take space-time to probably be some sort of emergent structure, or at the very least, space is some sort of emergent structure. And this is the big thing: is answering a lot of these questions is going to be difficult to do without that relevant quantum physics with respect to these energy scales and size scales that we just currently don't have any descriptions for.
Either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary just is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a region described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. Either way, the universe began to exist. Now,
and just because I think it's a worthwhile objection to throw out there, I can grant that the universe has an absolute beginning. Again, I'm not going to use the language of begins to exist because I take that to be unintelligible for reasons I've already outlined. But I can grant that the universe has some sort of absolute beginning, some sort of past boundary, and there literally just is nothing prior. There is no such thing as prior to that boundary. This doesn't do anything, I think, for theism whatsoever, because I take time to be tenseless, and so I could just say that the whole universe already exists as some brutally contingent, tenselessly extended structure, where it just has a boundary at one end, but that boundary doesn't mark like the actualization of the ontology of the space-time structure. The whole space-time structure exists, and it's there, and it just exists tenselessly. As Carl Sagan said, and as was quoted by Bertrand Russell, who I believe also said this, the universe just is, and that's all.
The video mentions scientific evidence for the universe's beginning, but there are also philosophical reasons to think that the universe began to exist. Just think about it for a minute. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of events in the past history of the universe is infinite. But how could an infinite number of past events elapse one after another in order for today to arrive? That would be like trying to count down all the negative numbers ending at zero. That seems to be an absurd task.
Yeah, that's absurd because that's a beginningless set. How do you start at a beginningless set and arrive at the set's end? So all the negative numbers all the way up to zero is a set that ends at zero but has no beginning. Yeah, how would you start counting a beginningless set? That just doesn't even make any sense.
For before you could count any number, you would already have to have counted an infinite number of numbers already. And if you could count down from infinity, then why did you finish only today? Why not yesterday? Or the day before that? At any point in the past, you will already have had an infinite amount of time to finish your countdown, and therefore you should already.
Just to answer this question quickly, so if there is a sort of inflationary multiverse where inflation stopped for our local universe, so to speak, but continued on and created a variety of other universes, that collection, this inflationary ensemble, would have some sort of beginning because it is produced, it's generated under an inflationary mechanism, and inflationary mechanisms, according to the BGV theorem, cannot be extended indefinitely into the past. Now, there are some, I want to say there's at least two, I know for a fact one, but I want to say I've seen another one. I wouldn't be able to tell you anything about them, and I would probably struggle to find them, but maybe I could. That try to argue that, well, no, there are some assumptions that we can make that are reasonable to make, where inflation can in fact be extended indefinitely into the past. Again, it's been a couple years since I've really looked into anything like that. I need to look into that again and really kind of nail down some understanding there. So in these moments, I can't just say, I think I've seen this, but I don't really know much about it. But yes, generally speaking, if there is an inflationary ensemble, that ensemble will have some sort of beginning, because the generative process must have some, that being inflation, must have some sort of beginning.
Already be done. These sorts of absurdities show that an actually infinite past is impossible. And
well, an actually infinite past is not impossible. And there have been logicians and mathematicians who have explained this quite clearly, actually. Alex Malpass being one. Adrian Moore is another. I'm trying to think of some others. And just, I think that somebody with a reasonable background in philosophy of mathematics more broadly, but specifically transfinite arithmetic, would say that there being an infinite past is not something that's impossible. It's at least it's certainly not logically impossible.
our next video explains these philosophical arguments.
Did the universe have a beginning? Or has it existed from eternity past? If it did have a beginning, this raises a question. Did the universe have a creator? In part one, we
I accidentally hit a button. Sorry about that. Woo!
Let's talk about the second question first.
Right.
Something else could not have created God beyond the universe to its personal creator.
Hold up. Give me just a second. That's why I hate buttons on your mouse that do stuff like that.
These philosophical arguments.
Here we go. Sorry about that, folks. I've got buttons on my mouse that do forward and back for the pages, and I hit them a lot. I don't like this mouse.
If it did have a beginning, this raises a question. Did the universe have a creator? In part one, we explored this question scientifically. Now let's look at it philosophically.
And we also established that science does not say anything about the universe having a creator. And most of the scientists working in this area, even if they believe that the universe has a creator, don't think the science seems to indicate that.
Aristotle believed the universe was eternal in the past. But Al-Ghazali disagreed. He pointed out that if the universe did not have a beginning, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But that's a problem, because the existence of an actually infinite number of past events leads to absurdity. It's metaphysically impossible.
Remember what I said earlier about metaphysical modality and saying things are metaphysically impossible.
Why? The mathematician David Hilbert illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem, then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out. And it gets even more absurd. Suppose an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk. No problem, says the manager. Then she moves each person into a room with a number twice that of his own room. So the person who was in room number 1 moves into room number 2. The person who was in 2 moves to 4. The person who was in 3 moves to 6, and so on. Since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests gratefully check in. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even crazier when the guests start to check out. Suppose all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead, all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left. And yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus, we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers. These absurdities show that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in the real world. Here is a second argument Ghazali offers against a past eternal universe. Suppose that for every 1 orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what if these 2 planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbits? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same.
That's false. So you could say that like the orbit of Saturn is Aleph naught, but then the order of Jupiter would be, I think, what Aleph. It's twice as many. That would is that Aleph 2? Like there you can define different types of infinities based on, I believe it's the concept of cardinality. So actually, no, in transfinite arithmetic, Jupiter still will have done more orbits, even though they're both infinity, because you can have infinities of different sizes. With Aleph naught being the lowest cardinal infinite. And then you can have Aleph 1 and Aleph 2 and Aleph 3. All these videos are really showing is that like infinity is a weird concept and certain operations on infinite sets aren't always going to be well defined or aren't always going to return consistent answers. But none of this means that the past could not be infinite.
Infinity. But that seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes. If the universe has always existed, then an infinite series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. It's like a sequence of dominoes, falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. The problem is that the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. It's today. So the number of events leading up to today could not possibly be infinite. The infinite is nowhere to be found
In reality, it neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play
is solely that of an idea. What objections might be raised to these arguments? Some people object that, unlike the rooms in Hilbert's hotel, the events of the past don't all exist at the same time. But we can easily tweak the story to get rid of this objection. Suppose the hotel has been under construction from eternity past, 1 room being added each year. How many rooms would there now be in the hotel? An actual infinite number. So if the past is infinite, that would imply that Hilbert's hotel could exist, which is absurd. Others have objected that an actually infinite number of things do exist, namely numbers and other mathematical entities. However, this objection presupposes that numbers really exist, but this is a highly disputed assumption that most philosophers reject. So if Ghazali's 2 arguments are right, then the universe is not eternal in the past. It must have a beginning. And we know intuitively that whatever begins to exist requires a cause of its existence. Thus,
I've never liked arguments from intuition, because as I think things like relativity and quantum mechanics have shown, our intuition doesn't really matter for the most part when it comes to how reality behaves. So I think when people say, oh, well, we just intuitively know this. Well, sure, but that doesn't mean that it's correct. I mean, we could go back 3,500 years and people would say, oh, it's just we intuitively know that the earth is flat, or we intuitively know that the sun moves around the earth. Because according to their intuitions, that's what they observed, that's what they experienced, that's what they thought. So I just don't think that intuition makes for a very strong argument, or I don't think that inferences made from intuition are always going to be very strong.
We are led to conclude that the universe has a cause of its existence. So what caused the universe? Atheist Daniel Dennett says the universe caused itself.
Yeah, I disagree with Daniel Dennett. I think most cosmologists probably would. I like how a lot of these people are like, well, this atheist philosopher once said this, and well, that's just silly, and therefore all atheists are silly. Like, come on.
But this is incoherent, because in order to cause itself to come into existence, the universe would have to exist before it existed. The cause of the universe must therefore be outside of the universe.
But that's incoherent, because outside is a spatially referential term, and if you're outside of the universe, then you're outside of space, where spatial reference become completely meaningless. They lose all meaning. So I don't know what it means to say that the cause of the universe would have to be outside of the very thing you need in order to make any sense of what the word outside means.
Spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormous.
Also, I take causality to be physical. If somebody wants to argue that causality can be non-physical, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, you're wrong. No, it can't. I'm just going to say, okay, cool. Give me an analysis of causation that is non-physical. What is causation? How do non-physical things cause physical things? It's just on that person to give what their analysis is there. And I have a feeling that I'm probably going to be left wanting, if I'm being honest.
Enormously powerful. Much like God.
And once more, somebody could grant all of these properties and just say, but it's non-agential. It's not an agent, and therefore isn't God. And there's not going to be anything inconsistent with them doing so.
Since something cannot come into being from nothing,
I'm glad that Dr. Craig said that, because I think that something that is often missed is if you're working from the principle out of nothing, nothing comes, then it follows that out of nothing can something be caused. You can't, if you can't get something from nothing, then that just includes causing something from nothing. And so you can't causally produce something from nothing. So how did God create the universe ex nihilo? Creatio ex nihilo would violate the principle ex nihilo nihil fit, or out of nothing nothing comes. So that's something that I think is often overlooked when people provide objections to some of these arguments, is that if you're granting the principle out of nothing nothing comes, ex nihilo nihil fit, then creatio ex nihilo would violate that very principle. If you can't get something out of nothing, then you can't do it by causing either, because there isn't anything upon which you can act causally to produce anything, because there isn't anything there that which you could produce from causally. So you can't appeal to a principle and then say that God created the universe in a way that violates that same principle you're using to argue for the existence of God.
the absolute beginning of the universe implies the existence of a beginningless, uncaused, timeless, spaceless, changeless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe.
I wonder if Craig is going to give his argument for the personhood of the cause of the universe at all.
That takes us to our next argument, which is misspelled on your handout. This is the T.
I guess not. Interesting.
teleological argument, not the theological argument, the teleological argument. And the contemporary version of this argument holds that God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the existence of intelligent life, like ours, depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. Scientists once believed that whatever the initial conditions of the universe, eventually intelligent life might evolve somewhere. But we now know that our existence is balanced on a razor's edge. The existence of intelligent life anywhere in the cosmos depends upon a conspiracy of initial conditions which must be fine-tuned to an accuracy that is literally incomprehensible and incalculable. The following video explains how this remarkable fine-tuning points to an intelligent designer of the universe.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere.
The thing with this argument that I want people to keep in mind is, okay, why does that matter? Why does it matter whether life specifically is something that would exist or not exist given the particular gnomic structure or the structure of the universe according to its constants and quantities and laws? Why would it matter?
There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind.
Why does it matter whether the universe is hostile to life or not?
The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely.
Why are they special?
What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are three live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this
There's just technically a false trilemma. They could just be brutally contingent.
plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even
I'd like to see the probability calculus as to why that we would least expect that.
if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
The examples of fine-tuning in the video are all up to date, accurate, and well established. Now, it's important to keep in mind here that the term fine-tuned does not mean designed. The expression is a neutral term, which just means that the range of life-permitting values for the fundamental constants and quantities of nature is extremely narrow. If the value
Well, why focus on what these values need to be for specifically life to develop? Sure, we can grant that that's narrow. Who cares? Why does it matter? That's the part that they don't want to do. And what this does is it forces the person pushing this style of a fine-tuning argument to effectively admit that, like, life is some sort of purposeful or intentful structure of reality, such that those values would need to fall into that extraordinarily narrow range to permit it, which seems to imply some intent to put them in that range such that life would develop. But I don't have any reason to suppose that's the case. I don't care what the values are for the permission of specifically life, because I don't see life as any sort of purposeful or intentful structure within reality. And I don't think there's any good arguments that it is.
Value of even one of these constants or quantities were to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the delicate balance required for the existence of life would be upset, and the universe would be life prohibiting instead. Fine-tuning in this neutral sense is well established. The question then,
it's still not largely what physicists mean when physicists are talking about fine-tuning. They're usually referring to values that have to be put in for certain parameters, and those values are very, very highly specified, and we don't know why they're so excuse me, they're so specified. That doesn't mean that there isn't an explanation. It doesn't mean that the explanation is that they were designed to be that way. It just means, I would argue, that it's a result from the incompleteness of our theorems and our theories, I should say, about physical reality, that we don't understand why they have to be so precise. Either that or that's just the way that they are, and it's just a brute contingent fact of reality, which is oddly enough what most philosophers broadly, as well as specifically philosophers of science, tend to think.
Then that we face is what is the best explanation of the cosmos.
I think it's also worth pointing out that, at least in my view, the universe is not finely tuned. Our physical theories about the universe are finely tuned. And if that's the case, then it's quite easy to see who finely tuned them. We did. And we finely tuned them largely because they're incomplete theories. Either that or these just represent brutally contingent features of reality. But there are a variety of explanations one can give here that do not suppose any sort of designer. And there's also other problems that you have with the designer, with this whole design hypothesis, is that for me, it seems very post hoc. Why would an all-powerful God need to finely tune a reality in order to get life? Also, people like William Lane Craig don't think that the natural world can produce life of its own accord anyway, that the production of life requires some sort of divine intervention to occur. So how is the universe that can't even produce life on its own finely tuned for the life it can't produce? It seems weird when a lot of these people like Dr. Craig here and like Frank Turek run a fine-tuning argument. Well, the universe is so finely tuned for the existence of life, and in the same breath turn around and say, but the natural processes alone can't produce life. Then what do you mean when you say that those natural processes are finely tuned for it? It just seems inconsistent.
Cosmic fine-tuning. There are 3 live options in the contemporary literature on fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. Accordingly, we can argue as follows. 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance, from which it follows 3, therefore it is due to design. As the video explains, the only serious alternative to design is the multiverse chance hypothesis. And there are multiple problems with this hypothesis, but let me just highlight one of the most important. If our universe were just a random member of a multiverse, then we ought to be observing a much different universe than we do. In fact, the most probable observable universe is one which consists of a single brain, which pops into existence by a random fluctuation with illusory perceptions of the external world. So if you accept the multiverse explanation, you're obligated to believe that you are all that exists. and that this auditorium, these people, the earth, your body, everything you perceive in the world are just illusions of your brain. No sane person believes such a thing. On atheism, therefore, it is highly improbable that there exists a randomly ordered multiverse. Ironically, the best hope for fans of the multiverse is to maintain that God created it and has ordered its worlds so that they are not randomly ordered. God could give preference to observable worlds which are cosmically fine-tuned to be rationally accepted.
So I'm going to share something else here that I want you guys to see. Where the fuck did, there we go. So this is amongst just general philosophers in the 2020 Phil Paper survey. This is a response to him saying that, well, these are the only 3 accepted positions. Well, first off, chance isn't even listed here as an option, but let's just put that under other. So you've got design, multiverse, which are 2 that he's advocated for, or like chance or something like that. No, most of them think that it's just a brute fact. It's just the way the world is, and there is no further explanation. Again, this is just amongst excuse me, just amongst general philosophers. This is amongst specifically philosophers of like philosophers of physics, philosophers of physical science. It's slightly higher, but it's still brute fact. This is what they say. Design in both is now design is above multiverse as an explanation amongst general philosophers, but amongst philosophers of the physical sciences, design is very, very small. What is it that they know? The people who think about this the hardest, the people who actually do have a physics background and also a philosophy background. What is it that, none of this means that this must be the correct position. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that, oh, well, look at what these philosophers believe. That means this is the correct position. No, what I'm showing is that when you say that, well, these are the only accepted options in the literature, well, that's clearly false because most of the experts here don't agree with that. They don't agree with your conclusions here. So I think it just shows that there's a lot more going on than what Dr. Craig is letting on here with respect to how the experts, how philosophers and metaphysicians and philosophers of science and even people like epistemologists and what have you think about this stuff. And that they're not coming to his conclusions. I think that there's probably good reasons for why they're not coming to his conclusions. But yeah, I just those are not the only accepted options, the ones that he's given. I would argue that I'm willing to grant that fine-tuning perhaps exists, but not as a thing out in the world, so much as a feature of the incompleteness of our physical theories about the world. And if fine-tuning is something out in the world, then it's just some brutally contingent feature of that's just the way the world is, and there isn't any further explanation for it.
Acceptable, the multiverse hypothesis needs God. With the failure of the multiverse hypothesis, the alternative of chance collapses. Neither physical necessity nor chance provides a good explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. So, there we have 3 very compelling arguments for the existence of a creator and designer of the universe. Leibniz's argument from contingency, the temporal version of the cosmological argument, and the teleological argument from fine-tuning. After our break, we'll come back and look at 2 more arguments for the existence of God. Well, we come
I'm so sorry. I was muted that whole time. Thank you for pointing that out, Skyworks. I would have just kept going. So I am going to take my own little break here. I'm just going to run to the restroom. It'll be just a minute or two. But before I do that, just to outline where we're at, I'm not one of the people, one of these atheists who says, oh, these arguments are all trash, stupid. They're so dumb. No, I think that most people who are presenting them are like, there's some genuineness, there's genuity to what they're doing. They genuinely believe that these arguments give you some decently good reasons to think that there might be a god, in the sense of there being some transcendent creator of the universe, or however they'll word it. But I think as I've shown here, at least up to this point, I think that there's a lot of problems with these arguments. I don't think it's nearly as cut and dry as Dr. Craig is making it out to be here. There's an extensive amount of literature on these arguments, defenses for them, and objections against them. So I always encourage people, read the literature, engage in the discussions, and really ask questions. Try to get at a deeper conceptual understanding of the terms being used and the concepts being employed, and really dig into what these things mean and how we can use these ideas to better understand the world. With that, I am going to use the restroom really quickly. I will be able to hear because I have headphones, so I am going to let the video play while I'm doing that.
We come to the fourth argument now, the moral argument, which contends that God makes sense of objective moral values and duties in the world. And the following video makes this argument very clear.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply.
I just wanted to say there is no objective up or down. Up or down are completely relative terms. They only really mean something in a gravitational field.
To other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So,
well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, you have intersubjective systems that are imposed on society through a variety of legal structures or something like that.
In a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
I don't think that really does anything but push the question back. So is God good because the things that he commands are good? Or are the things that God commands good because God is good? And then what does it mean to say that God is good? What is that? Like what are you predicating about God there?
Recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral...
I mean, not necessarily. There are people who actually have a preference for the pops and the cracks and the white noise of old records because it's very nostalgic for them, or what have you. And so they would say that the cleaner and the better, well, better is being again a normative term here, that the cleaner and crisper and more accurate, I guess you could say, sounding the recording is, that the better it is. Well, for them, maybe that's not the case. And we'll get into this after the video because again, I want to let the videos play, kind of let the argument get out there, and then we'll dive into it when Craig starts providing his defense. But there's a lot to be said there.
moral
I'm
action
sure we'll get
conforms to
into.
God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations
true.
or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another.
Well, if humans are animals and humans have moral obligations to one another, then this is clearly a false statement.
When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat
Some think that it has, though.
is just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No
Why?
action should be considered morally right or wrong.
Why?
But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals.
False.
We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5.
Well, that's just straightforwardly not true, because the first is a normative statement. The second would be, well, 2 + 2 = 4 would be analytic. So there's two completely different types of statements.
What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God.
So mathematics is an axiomatic system. As far as I understand it, moral systems are not axiomatic, at least the way that like a logic or a mathematics is going to be.
If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Now, I know that like 7 minutes ago, I was just talking about how like these arguments aren't horrible, and they do, the people who present them are being genuine. I think people who present the moral argument are being genuine, but I will say the moral argument is a horrible argument. It just is. This is a horrible argument for the existence of God. It is bad. It is just very bad. It is not a good argument. It's not even remotely reasonable. It's just a horrible argument for the existence of God.
Here, once again,
And
are
yes, we will get into
simple
why.
premises of this argument. One, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Now, when you hear this, the first thing out of your mouth should be, oh, why should I believe that? What's the argument for that? What's the argument that the only thing that can serve as a foundation for objective moral moral values and duties is something like a god. So I'm not even a moral realist, but yeah, like atheist moral realism is completely a thing. There's moral naturalism, there's moral non-naturalism, there's a variety of things. I'm not really sure what ground of morality really means. When somebody uses that term, I think it's worthwhile to have them sort of hash out what sort of grounding relation they're referring to there, just so that we know they're not just throwing out random terms to sound like they're educated on something they don't really know anything about. But yeah, the idea that if there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties is just really to say that objective moral values, to have an objective moral system requires the existence of God. And then I'm just going to want to hear an argument for that. And I think that everybody, the one thing that you should take away here is that anytime a theist tries to run this argument or something similar, don't immediately try to engage and say, nope, that's wrong, and here's why. Just be like, oh, well, what's the argument for that? Why should I think that the first premise is true? Convince me.
2, objective moral values and duties do exist.
That is also, I think, a clearly false premise. Again, I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't take that there are objective moral values and duties. So, yeah, the second premise is I would argue clearly false.
From which it follows 3, therefore, God exists. What makes this argument so powerful is that people generally believe both premises. In our pluralistic...
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. It's certainly not amongst moral philosophers, most of whom are both atheist and realist. So, yeah, that's I don't think that's true. Show me the statistics on that, please.
Age, students are scared to death of imposing their values on someone else. Therefore, they at least give lip service to relativism. So premise 1 seems correct to them. At the same
what?
time,
Hold on, what?
the plural generally believe both premises. In our pluralistic age, students are scared to death of imposing their values on someone else. Therefore, they at least give lip service to relativism. So premise 1 seems correct to them. At the same time, however,
I am not following that at all. I don't know what that was. What?
certain values have been deeply instilled into them, such as tolerance, open-mindedness, and love. In particular, they think it's objectively wrong to impose your values on someone else. And so
I don't know that that's true. I know Lance Bush of the channel Lance Independent has looked into a lot of research on this, and from what he said, it seems that and I mean he's got his PhD in this. Like he is a moral philosopher and a moral psychologist professionally. That's what he does, like, for a living. He has said that there's a lot of emerging literature that suggests that the average person actually probably has something closer to an anti-realist intuition. Well, he wouldn't use the word intuition, but I'm going to use it here with respect to morality rather than a realist intuition. So I don't think that it's true that most people, number one, think that morality is objective, and number two, that they think that if morality is, rather that morality can only be objective if God exists. So I mean, the first one is just flatly rejected by the vast majority of like the overwhelming majority of philosophers are going to reject the first premise of the moral argument, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And it is that I'm not shifting the burden. That is a premise. That is a proposition. That is a statement. It is just on the theist to provide an argument for that first premise. And I don't think anybody has ever provided a good argument. And I haven't heard one here yet. So
they're deeply committed to premise 2 as well. They've just never connected the dots. Now, perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind in sharing the moral argument is not to confuse moral ontology with moral epistemology. Now, what do I mean by that? Moral ontology has to do with the objective reality of moral values and duties. Moral epistemology has to do with how we come to know moral values and duties. The moral argument has nothing to say about moral epistemology. It is wholly about moral ontology, the grounding of objective moral values and duties in reality. But people inevitably confuse the two. For example, some people will think that you're claiming that in order to recognize objective moral values and duties, you have to believe in God. Others will say that our moral beliefs can be explained as a result of socio-biological conditioning. Both of these objections are irrelevant to the argument. You're not saying that in order to recognize objective moral values and duties, you have to believe in God. Rather, you're saying that God has to exist in order for there to be objective moral values and duties.
And you also have to provide an argument for why I should think that's the case.
And as for the origin of our moral beliefs, you're not denying the influence of socio-biological conditioning upon our moral beliefs. The socio-biological account at best shows how our perceptions of moral values and duties has evolved. But if moral values are gradually discovered, not invented, then our gradual and fallible perception of those values no more undermines their objective reality than our gradual, fallible perception of the physical world undermines its objective reality.
Why would God create moral perceptive, moral perceptive faculties that we use to perceive moral truths that fail, where we can get it wrong? Why would he do that? That would be my question there. If God created or serves as the grounding for some objective moral values and duties, why would he make us as agents such that we can fail to properly cognize those moral properties or those moral values and duties? It just seems, particularly if his intention is for us to properly cognize them and implement them in a way that leads us to develop the kinds of moral societies God, I would presume, wants us to develop. It seems a little ridiculous to me. Also, I don't think I think it's just clearly false that moral values and duties are something we discover. Why would that be the case? That seems to imply that the proposition murder is wrong was true before there were humans and before there was even any notion of murdering, let alone the ability for an agent to have any preference about it. And I take it to be the case that moral values are rooted in preferences. And I don't see why I wouldn't think that. That seems to be evidently true.
The argument makes no claim about how we come to know objective moral values and duties. And so these epistemological objections are not relevant. From the two premises, it follows logically that God exists. The moral argument complements the cosmological and design arguments by telling us something about the moral nature of the creator and designer of the universe. It gives us a personal, necessarily existing being who is not only perfectly good, but whose very nature is the standard of goodness and whose commands constitute our moral duties. Finally, number 5, the very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists. And our final video explains this surprising claim.
I guess with respect to the moral argument, I didn't know he was going to move off that so fast. That seems to be the one that he spent the least amount of time sort of hashing out there. Yeah, there's just I firmly believe there is no defense of the first premise. Like there are no reasons sufficient to motivate me, particularly somebody like me, an atheist, to accept the first premise of the moral argument that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties exist. Even if I were a realist, I think I would still have no more or no less motivation to accept that premise. So that, I mean, I was kind of hoping he was going to, usually it's something like, oh, well, you mean to tell me that you think rape or you think murder isn't really wrong? I was hoping we were going to hear something like that, because I don't know what the difference between some action being wrong and some action being really wrong is supposed to be. I don't know what the distinction is there. I don't think there is one. I think it's just sort of playing at semantic games and tugging at emotions rather than presenting any form of informative argument in favor of the first premise, or even of the second, which I also reject as being clearly false.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers, such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga, think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being.
And what exactly is that? What is a maximally great being? How is maximal greatness determined?
If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
Why? Why is that what maximal greatness is?
Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists.
No.
Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd? like a married bachelor or a square
No, it's just
circle or the smell
ill-defined.
of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the
Why
first
not?
place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great.
But there
could
is
always
for a
be one
maximally
more
great being. Yeah, why should I think that? What?
pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies?
Yeah, it's not known what properties make a maximally great being great. You just said some properties, but you didn't explain how those make something maximally great.
It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great
I know it could still be a pizza. It would just be a pizza that you can't eat.
pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
Well, now the premises of that argument went by pretty fast, so here they are again. And I notice on the handout, I use the expression greatest conceivable being rather than maximally great being. These are intended to be synonymous. And in the video, it uses, I think, the locution maximally great being, which is better than greatest conceivable being. So let me run the premises by you as they were in the video. Number one, it is possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists.
And that's a premise that I could like tentatively grant, depending on what we mean by maximal greatness.
Two, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Three, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world.
That's the main premise I'm going to reject. What property entails that a maximally great being exists in every possible world? The property of you saying that it does? That's not convincing. Why would I be convinced by you saying, well, it does because I say that it does? So haha, like that's not at all convincing.
Four, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Five, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Six, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Seven, therefore, God exists. Now, as the video explains, premises 2 to 7 are uncontroversial. The whole argument hangs on premise 1.
Well, that's not true. I think what was it, premise 3 or 4 was the one that I objected to. That's yeah.
Is it possible that God exists? And I like to simply leave this question open for the unbeliever to think about. You don't need to prove to him that it's possible that God exists. Just let him think about it. The mere conclusion that if it's possible that God exists, then God does exist is enough to give the atheist or agnostic serious food for thought.
I mean, not really. I think the argument that a lot of people give here is just what one of the axioms of a particular type of modal logic called S5, where the axiom is possibly necessarily P implies necessarily P. So that if it's possible that P is necessary, then P is necessary. So that if it's possible that God is necessary, then God is necessary. But that can just be parred by me saying that if it's possible that something, how does it go? Yeah. Possibly, necessarily not P implies not P. So I can just I had to make sure I got the negation in the right spot when I said that. That's why I paused there for a second. So they might argue, oh yeah, okay, so possibly necessarily P implies P, and I could say, well, possibly necessarily not P implies not P. So like you can you can just go about this parity of reasoning, and at that point you're going to have a very similar argument, one arguing for the positive and one arguing for the negative. And I think that alone is enough to, I mean, I don't think that either one of them really is going to probably be true. There's people like Joe Schmidt, in fact, who have recently argued that the negative side, the reverse modal ontological argument, as it's often called, that there are actually more reasons to motivate accepting that over the modal ontological argument. But I haven't fully read his paper. I've skimmed it like once, and then I watched a couple of interviews that he did talking about the whole thing. But I need to sit down and actually read the paper before I really have any major comments on it. But yeah, you can just par the argument, and I think that that's enough to undercut the argument. It's not. And then again, I think it's going to depend on your priors whether you're going to think the reverse modal ontological argument is better than the modal ontological argument or the other way around. But one can say, well, if it's possible that God exists necessarily, then God exists necessarily. And then say it is possible that God exists necessarily, therefore God exists necessarily. One can say, well, if it's possible that God exists necessarily, then God exists necessarily. It is possible that God does not exist, therefore God does not exist. So again, like same argument in both directions. Which one you pick is largely going to depend on your priors. And I think this is enough to undercut the ontological argument.
Now, the 5 arguments that I've shared with you this evening present a powerful cumulative case for the existence.
When not marred in a bunch of problems that immediately arise under a even slightly deeper philosophical analysis of the premises and of the concepts that underlie the premises that constitute these arguments.
Of God. Together, they yield a metaphysically necessary, uncaused, transcendent, immaterial, personal, creator and designer of the universe, who is the paradigm and source of absolute moral goodness.
Just remember, no argument has been given for why this thing should be considered personal. Perhaps I grant all of the other properties, but I think that it's just not a personal thing. What's the argument that I should think that it is? Motivate me to think that it is.
I'd like to close tonight with some practical suggestions about using these arguments in everyday conversations with an unbeliever. Non-believers are not used to running into Christians who can actually give reasons for what they believe.
Well, I don't know how true that is. I think like if you went out on the street and like presented one or two of these arguments to somebody in like Milwaukee, like somebody who would describe themselves as an atheist who lives in like Milwaukee, Wisconsin or some shit like that, they'd probably be like, oh, sure, that's interesting. I have to think about that. That fine. The thing is, most philosophers are atheists. I think that if you put most philosophers, just picked a random PhD philosopher in analytic philosophy from the Western world, just at random, plucked him or her out and put them in a debate with William Lane Craig, I would bet a lot of money William Lane Craig is going to win that debate. But I don't think that the truth of any positions turns on this. I think this just has to do with most philosophers don't really care about philosophy of religion. They don't really care about natural theology. They don't care about arguments for the existence of God. That, apologetics. They don't care. So they're not going to be versed in responding to those arguments. But if you plucked an atheist philosopher of religion who's very interested in that, like say Graham Oppie or Paul Draper, and had them debate William Lane Craig, I think both of those men have before, they would be a much, much more formidable foe for Dr. Craig to take on. And in both instances, they were, than your average philosopher. So I think that there are a lot more probably atheists and non-believers out there who are more equipped to handle these arguments than there have been in the past. And I think a lot of that has to do with, access to the internet and people like me who sit on the internet and talk about these things and give people objections that they can themselves give for these arguments and give them some more food for thought with respect to these arguments and really questioning whether these arguments are as sound as defenders like Dr. Craig make them out to be. And that's why you should subscribe to my channel and share it with all of your friends so that they don't get corrupted by the evil, evil Christians who are trying to bring you into their evil, evil ways. No, they're not evil. I kid. Although some of them
they tend to simply rest with slogans like, there's no evidence that God exists. And that becomes an effective conversation stopper for most Christians. But if you have these arguments in hand, rather than a conversation.
I also wanted to say the ontological argument I also think is a kind of just a bad, it's a really bad argument. It's not a good argument at all. They saved the worst two for last. Though I am going to be honest, I think the moral argument is worse than the ontological argument because the ontological argument is best addressed. I think it does require knowing a little bit more, particularly with respect to modal logic and stuff like that, for at least a lot of the common defenses of the ontological argument that are pushed today by the expert philosophers of religion. So for that reason, I would argue that the moral argument is a little bit it's a little bit worse than the ontological. It's just so bad. It's so fucking bad. The moral argument is a horrible argument for the existence of God. But yeah, the first three are like decent, there's problems with them. They don't really work, but they're not like disgustingly horrible, just completely unreasonable arguments to give. The moral argument, it definitely is. And so is the ontological argument, though not as much as the moral argument.
Stopper, that becomes a conversation starter. If the unbeliever says to you, there's no evidence that God exists, you should look at him with wide eyes and an open mouth and say, is that what you think? Well, I can think of at least 5 good arguments for God's existence. And then at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then boom, you're off and running. God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists. God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. And the very possibility of God's existence proves that God exists. Even if you don't have the arguments memorized, just
Of course I am. I get halfway through what I'm saying and I'm muted. But you know what? It happens. That's how we do things. So this is a sentiment that I see expressed a lot, primarily by non-believers, that arguments aren't evidence. And it is a sentiment that I disagree with. And the reason for that is my conception of evidence. I take that there are 2 things that are constitutive of evidence, at least generally speaking. that is absolutely professional YouTubers. We do things right around here. Number one, expectation, and number two, probability raising. So if something is being adduced as evidence for a hypothesis, I would say then that E is evidence for H if E is expected given H, and the obtention of E raises the probability of H. And I think that both inductive and certainly deductive arguments can, maybe there isn't so much an expectation value, but there's certainly this notion of probability raising. I think expectation can be, I think that, conclusions can be expected given certain premises. And then if the conclusions are true, I think that can raise the probability of the hypotheses or the ideas that those conclusions are being adduced to as evidence for. So I certainly think that deductive and inductive arguments can serve as evidence for positions. But again, people have different ideas about what evidence is. I take a more generalized idea with respect to evidence. So for me, yeah, I think arguments can be evidence.
Just being able to list the arguments is often enough to satisfy the unbeliever. I have found that just being able to list the arguments puts you far beyond the average Christian that the unbeliever has ever met. Now, if the unbeliever does have further questions and wants you to explain further, then share with him the premises of the argument. As we've seen, these arguments can be very simply formulated and are easy to memorize. A junior high school student can memorize these arguments, whatever begins to exist.
Sure, they might be easy to memorize, but how well does a junior high schooler understand a lot of the oftentimes somewhat complex, like analytic metaphysics and analytic philosophy that underlies these arguments? Modal logic isn't really, it's not like, oh God, it's so difficult, it's so hard, nobody gets it. But it's not like the easiest thing. It requires some understanding. You've got to understand the basics of logic, and then you've got to have the conceptual capacity to engage in that level of reasoning. Not only that, but a lot of the scientific data that is adduced as premises for these arguments, sometimes understanding a lot of that and really understanding the science behind it can be quite complex. The cosmology behind the Kalam cosmological argument actually can get quite complex, particularly when things like the BGV theorem are brought up and we're talking about, understanding classical space-time and even space-time in a semi-classical limit, understanding the cosmology of the expansion of space, understanding inflation. Those things, I think that maybe in a very simplistic, very popular level, superficial way, some, a 7th, 8th, 9th grader might understand some of that stuff, but I'm not like saying this to like discourage people that are that young from trying to understand this or like pursuing an understanding or an interest in these things. I'm just saying that there are some complexities in both science and philosophy when it comes to these arguments, and some of those complexities do require a number of years of thinking about these kinds of things to really have it hammered out in a way where you are going to be able to tackle some of the greatest defenders of these arguments, like Dr. Craig. Your average 10th or 11th grader that's maybe been thinking about these things and read some books and watched videos over the last few years is probably going to have a pretty strong and pretty admirable understanding of this stuff. But I still wouldn't put them up against a Paul Draper or a Graham Oppie, or if they're maybe a non-believer, up against a William Lane Craig or a Richard Swinburne. They're still probably not going to perform as well as taking those experts and putting them up against each other. So I think that's an important point to make here, is that sure, we can memorize these arguments, but there's a lot of deep material with respect to them. And it does require quite a bit of time of thinking and analyzing and engaging in maybe even just some general armchair philosophy. But this stuff does take some time to understand. Just being honest
has a
about
cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. These are simple, easily memorizable arguments. And having the premises memorized will help you to keep the conversation with an unbeliever on track. If the unbeliever starts to stray off track by getting into other subjects, just say to him
I am an atheist. I believe there are no gods.
politely, well, now, if you think that my conclusions are false, you must think that at least one of my premises is false. So, which premise do you reject and why?
And the thing is, I don't really want to say the way that William Lane Craig is trying to frame this right now, because I don't know if that's really his intention, but the way that this is oftentimes framed is that, oh, well, I've presented you a formal argument. You must reject one of my premises, and then you need to explain why you're rejecting the premise. And it's often done as like a way of making like the unbeliever in this instance has all their work cut out. They got to reject a premise and explain why. It's not that hard to reject a premise. Let's take the moral argument. If Craig said, well, which premise do you reject? I'd be like, the first premise. And if he said, well, why? I'd say, I've never, like, what's the argument for it? I'm not motivated to believe it. Nothing motivates me to believe it. Give me an argument for the first premise. Put them back on the back foot to defend the premise that you're rejecting. Just, that's all you have to do. You don't have to yourself have an argument that the premise is false. You can just say, I'm not motivated to think that it's true. Can you give me an argument for why I should be? That's all you have to do.
Focus on the premises. And if the unbeliever wants to go still deeper, then go with him. All of these arguments are further explained in my book, On Guard, which is a sort of Swiss Army knife for training in apologetics. It will enable...
I mean, for people who are getting into apologetics, whether you're a believer or a non-believer, On Guard is actually a good book to read because it does give a generalized overview that's not super technical of the arguments for the existence of God, so you know what to deal with. His book, Reasonable Faith, is like On Guard, except it's quite a bit more technical, quite a bit more philosophically involved. Goes a lot more deeply into the various concepts and ideas that underlie the arguments that Craig tends to run. But both are, I think, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, both of which are good material to read so that you can better understand these arguments from one of the world's leading contemporary analytic Christian philosophers. Because whether you like him or not, whether you agree with him or not, whether you think he's honest or not, Dr. Craig is one of the world's leading analytic Christian philosophers. And if you want to engage with analytic Christian philosophy, you're going to have to engage with the work that people like Dr. Craig have done.
And to answer the typical objections that are raised against...
And just to boot, I think, as I've shown here tonight, that's really not all that difficult to do. If you just do spend some time reading about this and talking with, maybe people who know a little bit more about these arguments, people who have, spent a decade or more looking into these arguments and debating this stuff online, people like myself, amongst a variety of others that you can find online, watching their content, just engaging with the material that's there, I think you can find that it's really not that difficult to object to some of these arguments.
Against them. And then, of course, it's my hope that you'll go to reasonablefaith.org on your mobile device and watch the video with your unbelieving friend and start a conversation with him. So, the arguments presented here constitute a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God. I hope that as you share the gospel with people, that these arguments might be useful in reaching out to atheists and agnostics in order to open their minds to belief in God. I look forward to your questions.
All right, let's go ahead and jump in.
So I'm probably not going to watch all the rest of this because this is still another a good almost half hour. But I might jump around some of the questions and then see if there's any that are interesting here.
Thank you so much for that. It's been amazing. And I am so glad a few of these to have the space to be asked. I think it's awesome. Just hold up your book this book. Defending Your Faith is a great resource I would highly recommend to you, called On Guard. You can get it all of us for our faith. Awesome. Is that cheating? Is everybody okay with that? Just teasing. So this first one, I'm trying to prioritize questions that were asked multiple times. There were a lot of questions. Really, these first two kind of clumped into one. I'll read them, and then I'll give you some space to answer them. Let me read both of these together because they kind of fit in one camp, and it was probably the most frequently asked question. If God can exist without cause, then why not the universe itself? Second question. If everything has an explanation for existence, and the creation of the universe is because of God, then couldn't an argument be made that something else could have created God? If whatever begins to exist has a cause, what caused God to exist?
Let's talk about the second question first. Something else could not have created God because God, by definition, is an eternal being and therefore never began to exist. So he couldn't have a cause. Now, certainly there could be a finite being that created our universe, say Zeus or Jupiter or something like that. But then that would be a contingent being that would also need an explanation of its existence. And so really, it would be part of the universe of
Wait, what? No, what? Zeus could be a non-contingent being, huh?
Contingent things. So that leads us to the first question. If God can exist without a cause, why not the universe itself? And the answer would be, well, in order for the universe to exist without a cause, it would have to be a metaphysically necessary being.
No, it wouldn't. It could just be brutally contingent.
And that just doesn't seem to be correct. The universe is composed of contingent things that didn't have to exist, and the universe itself doesn't seem to be metaphysically necessary. The universe could have failed to exist, and this is...
But it didn't.
It's especially obvious by the fact that it did have a beginning. If it had a beginning, then that means it doesn't exist necessarily. It came into being. So...
Well, again, having a beginning doesn't imply some like start or actualization to the entity's ontology.
I don't think that the argument from contingency can be avoided by saying that the universe is metaphysically necessary. The universe is contingent, and this is obvious. Especially...
I mean, one could just be some sort of necessitarian, and argue that yes, the universe is necessary. So, I mean, I think that maybe there's some bullets that one might have to bite if they took that view, but it's not like it's not a view that people can't take.
Especially from its beginning. So there needs to be something beyond the universe that is non-contingent and therefore eternal, timeless, spaceless, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Very good. That's the exact same way I would have answered that question. Good. This is one question that I wanted to let slip in here that's not particularly related to the topics we talked about tonight, but I think because of your experience, generation, I love this question. If you're speaking to the next generation of Christian thinkers and leaders, what single area of study or training do you believe will be the most crucial for defending the faith in the next 50 years?
I thought there might be a question like this, and my answer would be, learn the basic rules of logic. There are only about 9.
I mean, yeah, I think everybody should, but I don't think that's gonna get you to belief in God by any means. It might do something else. You never know.
Rules of logic that govern all of reasoning. And if you can
I hate that language. Govern all of no. Stop.
master these 9 rules of logic, you will be able to construct logically valid arguments like those I've shared tonight, and you will be able to spot logic.
And something else that I think that just popped into my head when Craig says that I think is worthwhile to point out is, so just for anybody that might not know, with deductive arguments, they can be valid and they can be sound. To say that a deductive argument is valid is just to say that the conclusion logically follows from the premises. Premises can be ridiculous, but if the conclusion follows from them, it is a valid argument. An example of a ridiculous but still valid argument would be, if the moon is made of green cheese, then I am a moose. The moon is made of green cheese, therefore I am a moose. Completely deductively valid. That conclusion follows from the premises. Obviously, the premises are ridiculous, but that's not what validity cares about. All it cares about is whether the conclusion follows. And in that instance, it does. Now, soundness deals with the truth of the premises. If the premises, and it also presumes validity. So soundness first presumes validity, that the conclusion follows, and the premises are actually true such that the conclusion is guaranteed, or the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed. Now, deductive validity or logical validity in an argument, that your conclusion follows from your premises. You want an argument that's valid, but validity simplicator is not a high bar for an argument. It's the expectation. Any argument that you present in defense of your worldview, assuming that it's a deductive argument, because inductive arguments deal with strength and cogency, not validity and soundness. If it's a deductive argument, any argument that you're presenting in defense of a position should be valid at the very least. That's just an expectation. So that's not a high bar. So if somebody says, oh, well, my argument's valid, sure, that doesn't tell me anything about whether or not it's true.
Logical fallacies in the arguments of your opponents. So how do you learn the basic rules of logic? Well, we have developed a reasonable fact of logic. We
talked a little bit about practically implementing these, but lots of these questions. Where should we enter into this conversation with our neighbors? How do we begin the conversation? Where do we start?
The concept was used as means and as inescapable duration. How theistic. There are forms, an entry point for talking about.
I want to skip down here because this kind of goes into the moralistic argument. What would you say to those who argue that a larger, I'm on this one right here, that a larger group's cumulative subjective morality is what dictates the group's objective morality and sets the standard for what is moral to the whole?
That's actually an interesting question. That's playing on this notion of intersubjectivity, that morality can be subjective and still a large group of people agree on that subjective moral value, and therefore like systematically implement or impose a rule based on it on the broader society in which they live, or something along those lines. Let's see how Dr. Craig answers.
Yeah, the question is self-contradictory. It's incoherent. It says the larger group's cumulative subjective.
What the fuck did he just say? It's incoherent.
Morality is what dictates the group's objective morality.
Wait.
Is what cumulative subjective. It says the larger group's cumulative subjective morality is what dictates the group's objective morality.
That's not what the question was asking. The question was asking, how do we know that the moral values that are imposed on our societies are not just intersubjectively agreed upon, rather than being some stance independent objective standard? So they're not saying like, how do you know that subjective morality doesn't justify objective morality? That's not at least how I understood that question. I'm not going to accuse Dr. Craig of committing a straw man, because I don't think that he is, although it's possible. I think that he's genuinely not understanding the question that was asked.
That's self-contradictory. If it is a subjective morality that the group has decided on, then it's not an objective morality, even if they are deluded in thinking that it does. They are just suffering under a kind of moral.
It seemed to me the question was more like, how do you differentiate between a morality being like objective versus like intersubjective? That's what I maybe I misunderstood the question. You know, I'm a fucking idiot. It could be possible.
Delusion. And this is the problem with theories of morality that say, well, it's just a social contract that we make with one another, and we sort of make up these moral values so that we can live together and so forth. In that case, the child rapist or the child abuser doesn't do anything really wrong. He just acts.
Yeah, but what does it mean to say that he doesn't do anything really wrong? What work is the word really doing there?
Unfashionably. He's not conforming to the social contract. And that, I think.
Yeah, and that's bad. That's bad to not conform to the social contract, at least generally speaking. Or I should say rather, ideally speaking.
Objective, good and evil, right and wrong.
Yeah, great. Don't know who asked that question. What do you think is the most compelling atheistic argument against the existence of God?
I think that the argument from the
hiddenness. Yep, I knew he was going to say the argument from hiddenness. If you don't know that much, or if you're not really up to speed on the argument from hiddenness, Justin Schieber of Real Atheology, it's a YouTube channel, has a really good, solid series on the argument from hiddenness. And there's actually a debate. I can't remember who he's debating. I almost want to say Eric Hernandez, but I don't think that's who it is. Maybe it is, but I don't know. But where he presents the argument from hiddenness and does actually, I think, a really good job of defending it. So check out that channel and check out Justin Schieber's videos on that if you want to like a really, really good, solid, and very philosophical defense of the argument from hiddenness, which I would argue with alongside I think the argument from evil, the logical argument from evil, and then the argument from hiddenness are easily the two strongest arguments for atheism, at least against like classical theism, if not specifically classical Christian theism.
Is the most powerful atheistic argument. God could be a lot more obvious if he wanted to. Yep. And yet, it seems so often that God is hidden. We cry out to him, and he doesn't answer our prayers. He seems silent. And so the suspicion arises that there's really nobody out there. And so this argument from divine hiddenness, I think, is one.
But also something that I think is worthwhile to point out is I think it's honest, because there are some apologists that'll be like, oh, well, you know, I don't really think there are any good arguments for atheism. I think all of them, you know, they all fail for a variety of reasons. I don't think any of them are strong. But for Craig to be like, no, I think that there's at least one argument that atheists have that's, I mean, at least prima facie, a pretty powerful argument, or at least a pretty convincing, again, at least prima facie argument for atheism. I think it is honest.
That is very powerful. And I have a twofold response to this. Full evidence that they're vacuum. We've got no reason to believe in God, but if you exactly think of more knowledge and show that if God made his existence more.
Very good.
And so what the atheist, God made his existence more obvious, that love him and find salvation. And I don't see any way to lodge in love with it. Let's repair and just story, but evident.
About in a few of the different arguments, you talked about recent science and new discoveries. Talk a little bit, two-pronged question. What scientific discovery throughout your career has promoted or helped the Christian argument the most? Mm-hmm. And what scientific discovery throughout your career has threatened the Christian story the most?
It's really a toss-up between the discovery of the origin of the universe, which only happened during the 1920s with the development of this Friedman-Lemaitre model of an expanding universe, that changed everything. For millennia, people had always believed that the universe had always existed. It was just there. And the idea that the universe had a beginning and is not
The universe can still just exist, like just be there, even if it's bounded at one end.
always existed was just absolutely
Just for clarification's sake, that's going to be a difference between how Dr. Craig views time and how I view time. He takes an a-theoretic view, primarily presentism, and I take a b-theoretic view.
world changing. So that was an enormous change in the 20th century. And then rivaling it would be the discovery of the fine tuning of the universe. This has really rocked scientists. I've seen.
I don't think it has. Again, I don't take fine tuning to be a feature of the world. It's a feature of our physical theories about the world.
Any number of statements by non-believers saying this is a good argument for the existence of God. Now, they might not be ready to believe in God, but they will say, yes, this is a genuinely good argument. People are really impressed with the argument from fine-tuning. And it's basically come down to the multiverse versus God. Those are the two options.
It's well, as we saw, it's not. Most philosophers generally, and then philosophers specifically of physical science, to a slightly higher degree, to take fine-tuning to just be brutally contingent.
Today, multiverse or God, and I explained some of the problems.
And if you ask most physicists, that's probably something that I feel very confident saying most of them would likely agree with.
With the multiverse. Now, in terms of the other side, I'm tempted to say the theory of biological evolution, which seems to undercut human specialness and complete from brain and free neurology thing. But
Yeah, science girls would be good for me. Let's try to get to a few just specific ones in the few minutes we got left. Instead of there being a creator who fine-tuned the universe, why couldn't life have adapted itself to livable conditions?
because there wouldn't be any life. There wouldn't be any life to adapt to anything. I don't think people appreciate the catastrophic consequences of changing the values of these constants and quantities. It's not just that maybe some other form of life would have evolved in the universe or something of that sort. It's that there wouldn't be any planets. There wouldn't be any stars. There wouldn't be any place for life to exist.
And some of them, you could still have some of that stuff in a universe and just no life.
There wouldn't be any chemistry. There wouldn't be matter in the absence of the fine-tuning.
But the other question is, why does God need all that stuff for life, to like make beings like us? Why do we need to be embodied physical agents for God to create us? Why can't we just be spiritual beings? Particularly if this is like an all-powerful God. Why does he need such a precisely finely tuned universe for us at all? Why can't I mean, he's all powerful. He could put us in any reality that he made.
So the idea that life is going to exist and then adapt itself, consequence. I guess not, because I've already addressed it. The question is not how our moral beliefs originated. We don't need to deny the influence of sociobiological conditioning. The question is about, do we gradually and fallibly come to apprehend an objective moral realm, or do we not? And
we don't.
And the fact that our beliefs are conditioned by biology and our parental upbringing and society does nothing to undermine the objectivity of moral values and duties.
Great.
I mean, I think maybe it does, but I think that would take a little bit of hashing out. I would just reiterate the objection I brought up earlier. If there is some sort of objective standard or objective set of values, moral values and duties, and they're grounded in God, and God created us as agents with moral perceptive faculties, why did he create it such that our moral perceptive faculties can fail to get it right? What purpose does he have for doing that?
This is a very specific question, but it came in multiple times. Can you elaborate more on the definition of a self-necessary being in the contingency argument?
Yes. You know, this is so interesting because I don't think most Christians have a truly exalted concept of God. They think that God is just something that happens to exist, that he just happens to be there. He's a contingent being like we are. But the concept of God is that this is a metaphysically necessary being. That is to say, he is a being that exists by a necessity of his own nature, and therefore it is impossible for God not to.
Well, what about God's nature necessitates his existence, other than saying that it does?
Exist. To put it visually, God exists in every possible world.
And in virtue of what is it that God exists in every possible world?
Just as the
Again, other than the mere statement that he does.
Ontological argument says. And if you have trouble grasping this idea of necessary existence, then again, I would invite you to think about mathematical entities, things like numbers, sets, geometrical shapes. Mathematicians who think that these really exist will say they're not.
Didn't in one of the arguments, in one of the videos for one of his arguments, it say that most mathematicians don't take numbers to actually exist, and now he's appealing to the existence of numbers as these metaphysically necessary entities in order to run the ontological argument? Seems interesting, doesn't it? And by the way, unless his views have changed, and I don't think that they have, Dr. Craig is a nominalist about abstracta, so.
Not contingent, they just don't happen to exist. It's necessary that they exist. They exist necessarily. Now, I don't believe that these mathematical objects really exist. I think there's just sort of like ideas. But nevertheless, philosophers who do believe in these mathematical entities don't think that they're contingent. They believe that they are metaphysically necessary beings. So this isn't special pleading for God as a metaphysically necessary being. There are other beings that philosophers have identified as being metaphysically necessary. But the idea here is that by their own nature, they exist and therefore cannot fail to exist.
Great. Okay.
I mean, I would ask the same thing about numbers. In virtue of what do numbers exist necessarily?
One or two more. Let's say you're talking to your neighbor, and you have all these arguments memorized, and they get to it, they're like, Uncle, okay, I agree. There something. This was created. I believe that this was a creation. It has a beginning. And the next few weeks, we're really talking about this, but thoughts on this? Beginning.
Yes.
And as you're
talking Muslims and who the unbelieved to claims radical personal claims publicly, and after Jan and I moved to Germany, where I did my doctoral studies in theology, good grounds for believing that God has and he has.
Amen. We should clap for that, I think. Beautiful. So powerful. Will you tell everybody, I know you've mentioned it once or twice, tell everybody how they can get more of this content, how they can follow along with you. Where's the best place to go?
Yes.
Alrighty, so we've reached the end of that video. Interesting video. Again, these 5 arguments, these are nothing new. As I'm sure most people were expecting, or rather not expecting anything new. I think that there's a variety of solid objections to these arguments that certainly undercut the truth of either their premises or their conclusions, for that matter. And so I don't think that these are I think they're arguments for the existence of God. I think that people can run them. I think that they're worth talking about. Are they good? By my lights, no. According to my priors, no, I wouldn't classify them as good arguments. They don't motivate me to think that God exists, and that's largely because there's such a wide array of objections that one can raise to these arguments. But I am going to leave it there, folks, and until next time, I don't know when I'm going to stream next. Tomorrow I will be on JL Warren's channel, Bridge the Divide. So if you are familiar with him and his channel, you can see me there. If you're not familiar with him and his channel, you should go check him out. He's got a lot of really, really good content, a lot of really good response videos to to a lot of the theists out there. So definitely worth checking out. Anyway, guys, until next time.